There's a type of funeral that even the most experienced funeral directors find haunting. A funeral where no one shows up to say goodbye, where the flowers wilt before the ceremony even begins, where the silence is so deep you can hear your own heartbeat against your ribs. My name is Marcus, and for 23 years I've prepared bodies for the final farewell. 23 years of restoring dignity to those who've passed, offering comfort to grieving families, ensuring no life ends without being properly honored. But there's one case that made me question everything about death, life, and what happens to those who simply disappear. What happens when you prepare a funeral and no one shows up? When there are no tears, no shared memories, no "I'm going to miss you"? You think it's just work, just another case. But what happens when you find out that not even the deceased was there? If you believe every deceased person deserves a goodbye, that every life leaves a mark, that it's impossible to simply vanish without a trace, maybe you should stop listening now. Because what you're about to hear will shake your beliefs about human existence. This is the story of Harold Grimsby, the man who died alone, was buried alone, but who, in truth, was never really there. The man who taught me that some funerals are portals to truths we'd rather not know. And if you're wondering how it's possible for a dead person not to be at their own funeral, well, get ready to discover that death is much more complicated than we imagined. Get ready to meet the forgotten, those who die without leaving a trace, without stories, with no one to mourn them. Prepare yourself to understand that some funerals are not farewells. They are calls. Calls for those who have been forgotten, ignored, erased from the world's memory, and sometimes they come back. It was December 2021. Winter had arrived early that year, covering our city with a layer of snow that seemed to absorb sound, creating an unnatural silence that extended to everyone, even inside the funeral home. I was organizing the files when I received a call that would forever change my understanding of death. "Good afternoon, Morrison Funeral Home," I answered, as always. The voice on the other end was formal, cold, professional. "I need you to prepare a funeral for Harold Grimsby," the man said, identifying himself as Dr. William Ashford, a lawyer. "He died alone at home a week ago, no family, no friends. I am the executor of the will." Cases like this weren't uncommon. We live in a society where many people die alone, forgotten, with no family or social ties. It was sad, but part of our job was to give dignity to these cases as well. But there was something about Dr. Ashford's voice that bothered me, a quality distant, as if he were reading from a script. Details noted: Harold Grimsby, 67 years old, address at 1247 Maple Street, cause of death listed as multiple organ failure. Simple funeral, no religious ceremony, just a basic farewell. "Will there be any guests?" I asked. "No," Dr. Ashford quickly replied. Harold was completely alone. The next day, my assistant David and I went to retrieve the body. 1247 Maple Street was tucked away in an old neighborhood of the city, where the houses were at least 8 years old and held secrets in every floorboard. But when we arrived at the address, something was wrong. The house was there, but empty. Not empty in the sense of having no furniture. Empty in the sense of never having been lived in. The windows were too clean, the grass cut with military precision, the paint on the walls without any sign of wear or human touch. We found Harold in the bedroom, lying on the bed as if he had peacefully adorned himself. But there was something disturbing about the scene. The man was dressed in a perfect suit, his hands placed over his chest, his eyes closed perfectly. It looked more like a staged scene than a natural death. "It looks like someone already prepared the body," David commented. And he was right. Harold Grimsby appeared to have been prepared by a professional. But who and why? There were no signs that another funeral director had been there. We transferred Harold to our van, but throughout the journey we felt an oddness that we couldn't explain. It was as if we were transporting something that wasn't exactly a body. Something lighter, more empty. When we arrived at the funeral home, I placed Harold on the preparation table. It was then that I began to notice details that disturbed me deeply. His hair was perfectly cut, his nails trimmed and clean, His skin had a color that didn't match someone who had died a week ago. Even stranger, Harold had no odor. Bodies in decomposition have a distinct smell, but Harold smelled of nothing. It was as if he were made of wax, a perfect replica of a human being, but without the substance that makes us human. That night, I tried calling Dr. Ashford to clarify some details about Harold. I wanted to learn more about his life, his story, to prepare an appropriate ceremony, even if simple. But the number was disconnected, as if it had never existed. It was then that I began to suspect that Harold Grimsby wasn't just another case of a lonely death. There was something fundamentally wrong with the whole situation, and the more I investigated, the more I realized I had stumbled upon something that defied everything I thought I knew about life and death. The next morning, I began the actual preparation of Harold Grimsby, but from the very first moment, I realized something was terribly wrong. My equipment, which had worked perfectly for years, began to malfunction in inexplicable ways. The temperature monitor couldn't register the body's temperature. The reading kept flickering between impossible numbers, sometimes 32 degrees, sometimes 98 degrees, sometimes temperatures that didn't even exist. The scale showed different weights with every measurement. 150 pounds, then 200, then 0. I tried measuring Harold manually. That's when things got even stranger. His dimensions changed depending on how I looked at him. Sometimes he seemed to be 5'8", other times 6'2". It was as if Harold existed in multiple versions simultaneously. During the physical examination, I discovered something impossible. Harold Grimsby had no digital collections, no scars, no birthmarks, no distinguishing features of any kind, not even the small imperfections that every human being has. It was as if he were a generic model of a person, an artistic representation of what a man should be. Even more disturbing, Harold had no medical history, no vaccination scars, no evidence of surgeries, no signs of past illnesses. It was as if he had existed in a sterile bubble, completely isolated from the experiences that shape a human body over a lifetime. But the most unsettling part were his eyes. Even in death, they seemed to be searching for something, not fixed on the ceiling as is usual, but moving carefully, as if Harold were dreaming or waiting for someone. The lights in the room began to flicker, first subtly, then more pronounced. The temperature oscillated between biting cold and suffocating heat, with no logical pattern. It was as if reality itself around Harold was disturbing. I tried to take notes on the case, but I discovered something terrifying. 5 minutes after writing anything about Harold, I completely forgot what I had written. My own handwriting became illegible to me, as if my brain refused to process information about him. I decided to take photos of the body for documentation. But when I revealed the images, Harold appeared differently in each photo. Sometimes younger, sometimes older, sometimes with seemingly completely different features. It was as if the camera captured alternative versions of him. I tried calling Dr. Ashford again. This time, an automated recording said the number had been disconnected due to non-payment 6 months ago, but I had spoken to him just 2 days earlier. How was that possible? I went to the city's archives looking for information about Harold Grimsby. The address on Maple Street 1247 was listed in the records, but there hadn't been any residents listed there in the last 5 years. No electricity, water, phone bills, or any other services in Harold Grimsby's name. That's when I began to understand that Harold Grimsby might not exactly be real. Not in the traditional sense of the word. He had a physical body, but no history, no past, no connections to the world of the living. That night, when I finished the work and prepared to leave, something happened that chilled my blood. Harold sat up on the preparation table. Not a post-mortem reflex movement, but a deliberate and controlled one. "You're trying too hard," he said, with a voice that sounded like echoes from a deep well. "Stop searching for my story. Stop trying to understand me. Some people exist only to depart, never to live." I ran out of the funeral home. When I returned the next morning, Harold was lying exactly as I had left him, as if nothing had happened. But beside the table, there was a message written in my own handwriting. "Don't try to remember, just finish it." It was then that I realized Harold Grimsby wasn't just another lonely dead person. He was something different, something that existed at the boundary between reality and something else. And the more I tried to understand him, the more the reality around me itself became terrifying. On the eve of the funeral, I decided to investigate Dr. William Ashford's identity more deeply. If Harold was a mystery, perhaps his supposed lawyer could provide answers. But what I discovered made me question not only Harold's identity, but the nature of reality itself. I searched for Dr. William Ashford in every professional record I had access to: bar association, business records, notaries, courts. Nothing. There was no lawyer by that name in our city, state, or even country. The address he had provided simply didn't exist. The office number led to a diner that had been operating in the same location for 15 years. When I asked the owner about Dr. Ashford, he laughed. "Man, I've never heard that name in my life." That's when I had a disturbing idea. What if Harold Grimsby didn't officially exist either? I went through the city's death records, hospitals, notaries. I searched for Harold Grimsby, born in 1954, 1953, 1955. Nothing. No birth records, no social security number, no legal existence. But it was when I expanded my search that I found something that froze me to the bone. Harold Grimsby did exist, but not as I expected. I found his death record, dated December 23, 1971, 50 years ago. According to the records, Harold Grimsby had died at 17 in 1971. Sudden death, cause undetermined. No family, no friends, no one to claim the body. He had disappeared from the municipal morgue without explanation, and the case was filed as body not located. I read and reread the record several times. Harold Grimsby, 17 years old, 1971. But the man I had prepared was at least 67 years old, born around 1954. The dates didn't make sense, unless it wasn't the same Harold. That night I returned to the funeral home with a theory that terrified me. What if the Harold I was preparing was the same one who had died in 1971? What if he had never aged during those 50 years, trapped in some limbo, waiting for a farewell that had finally come? When I entered the preparation room, Harold was sitting on the edge of the table, just as I expected. But this time, he didn't seem to be 67 years old. He seemed younger, closer to the 17 years listed on the death record. "You figured it out," he said, smiling sadly. "I knew you'd eventually figure it out. You're persistent, Marcus. More persistent than the others." "The others?" Harold chuckled softly. "You think you're the first funeral director I've met in 50 years? Harold told me his story. How he had died young and alone in 1971. How his body had disappeared before anyone could claim it. How he had been trapped between worlds, aging slowly, waiting for someone who cared enough to give him a proper farewell. But here's the problem," Harold continued. "Every time someone tries to help me, every time they prepare my funeral, I disappear. I can't stay long enough for the ceremony. It's like I'm a ghost stuck in an endless loop, always on the brink of finding peace, but never able to." "And are there others like you?" Harold nodded sadly. "Hundreds. All of us who died alone, forgotten, with no one to say goodbye. All stuck in the same limbo, aging, waiting." "Is Dr. Ashford one of you?" Harold revealed. "William died in 1934. He was a lawyer, died alone in his office, and no one found the body for weeks." It was then that I realized Harold wasn't just an isolated case. He represented an entire population of forgotten ones, people who died without leaving a trace, with no one to mourn them. And somehow they had found a way to try to get what was denied to them, a dignified farewell. "So, tomorrow's funeral," I began. "Probably won't happen," Harold finished. "I'll disappear like it always happens. But this time I feel it might be different. This time I feel that you really care. What can I do to help?" Harold looked at me with eyes that carried 50 years of loneliness. "Just don't give up on me. Even if I disappear tomorrow, remember that we existed." The day of the funeral arrived with a dense fog that seemed to envelop the entire city. I arrived at the funeral home at 8 a.m. to make the final preparations, but my heart was already heavy. There was a sense in the air that something definitive was about to happen. When I entered the preparation room, Harold was there, but different from all the other times. He seemed solid, more real, as if he had finally found a way to fully anchor himself in our reality. I prepared the chapel as I always did, even though I knew no one would come. Simple flowers, soft music, a few chairs arranged respectfully. It was a funeral for no one, but I wanted it to be perfect. Harold deserved that after 50 years of waiting. At 2:30 p.m., half an hour before the service, I went to check on Harold one last time. The casket was open, but empty. Completely empty. There wasn't even an imprint of a body in the lining. It was as if Harold had simply dissolved. My first instinct was to search for him around the funeral home. Maybe he had fallen, maybe I didn't know what. But Harold had disappeared completely. There were no traces, no signs that a body had been there. At exactly 3 p.m., I opened the chapel doors for the funeral I knew would be empty. But when I looked inside, my heart nearly stopped. The chapel was full. Dozens of people sitting respectfully in the pews, all facing the altar. But these people, they weren't normal. All dressed in clothes from different decades, some from the 1920s, others from the 1950s, and others more recent. They all had an ethereal, translucent quality, and all of them had the same expression in their eyes, a mix of hope and melancholy. When I stepped into the chapel, they turned to look at me. There were faces of all ages, all ethnicities, all kinds of people. But they all shared one characteristic. They were the forgotten. The ones who died alone, the ones who never had a proper goodbye. Harold appeared beside me, now clearly translucent. "Thank you," he said. "You were the first to truly care. Because of that, we were able to manifest. We were able to have our moment of farewell." The ceremony began without me saying a word. Soft music filled the air, coming from nowhere. The attendees rose in unison, bowed their heads in reverence. It was as if they knew exactly what to do. I spoke a few simple words about how every life has value, about how no one should leave without being remembered, about how love and respect can transcend even death. The words came naturally, as if dictated by a greater force. During my speech, I realized I wasn't just speaking about Harold, I was speaking about all of them. Every person in the chapel had a story of loneliness, of being forgotten, of leaving without a trace, and they all deserved to be honored. When I finished, one of the figures spoke up. She was an elderly woman dressed in 1940s clothing. "Thank you," she said, her voice echoing like a whisper of wind. "On behalf of all of us, thank you for seeing us, for remembering us." One by one, they began to disappear, not in a frightening way, but like lights gently fading out. Each disappearance was accompanied by a smile, a nod, a whispered, "Thank you." Harold was the last to go. He moved away from me, and for a moment, he seemed completely solid again. "So you gave us what we've been looking for all this time," he said. "A witness, someone who cared enough to see us, hear us, remember us." And then he, too, disappeared, leaving only a sense of peace in the chapel. A deep, complete peace, as if decades of suffering had finally come to an end. I stood alone in the empty chapel, but I didn't feel alone. There was a comforting presence in the air, a certainty that I had done something important, something necessary, something that went beyond my work as a funeral director. After that day, my perspective on my work changed completely. Understanding that being a funeral director goes far beyond preparing bodies and organizing ceremonies. Sometimes, we are the last people to witness a life, the last to offer dignity and respect. I began to keep special records of cases like Harold's, people who die alone, forgotten, with no one to claim their bodies. I research their stories, look for distant relatives, do everything I can to ensure they have at least a basic farewell. I discovered that there are more Harold Grimsbys than we imagine. In every city, in every era, there have always been people who simply vanished from the world without leaving a trace. Isolated elderly, people with mental health issues, undocumented immigrants, young people who ran away from home and never returned. Sometimes I receive strange calls, distant, almost inaudible voices asking for help, numbers that don't exist when I try to return them, addresses that lead to empty houses. I know it's them, the forgotten, trying to make contact, trying to get the farewell they deserve. I regularly visit the municipal cemetery, especially the section for the unclaimed. I bring flowers to nameless graves, say a few words for those who never had anyone to speak for them. It's my way of honoring Harold and all the others I met that day. I never saw Harold again, but sometimes I feel his presence, especially when I'm working on similar cases. It's as if he's become my invisible guide, helping me identify those who need special attention. 3 months after Harold's funeral, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside there was only an old black and white photo. It showed a 17-year-old smiling at the camera, clearly happy. On the back, written in careful handwriting, Harold Grimsby, 1954. Thank you for remembering me. This photo now sits on my desk, alongside others I've received over time, faces of people no one else remembers, but who found peace through the compassion of a stranger. They've taught me that death is not the end of the human need for connection and dignity. Harold Grimsby taught me that some souls don't rest because they were never protected, never remembered. That death is not just a physical transition, but an emotional and spiritual one that needs to be witnessed, honored, respected, even by strangers, even 50 years later. I've learned that my work holds much greater meaning than I ever imagined. I'm not just someone who prepares bodies. I'm a bridge between worlds, a guardian of human dignity, a witness to the importance of each individual life. If you've made it this far, if you're still with me after this confession, leave the word witness in the comments, because we all deserve to be remembered. We all deserve a farewell, and sometimes the forgotten return to claim what was denied to them in life. Remember, no life is too small to be honored. No death is too insignificant to be witnessed. And if you know someone who lives alone, who seems forgotten by the world, maybe it's time to offer a little company. Because no one should leave without knowing that their life had meaning. Harold and all the forgotten have taught me that compassion can transcend even death. That a simple act of kindness, remembrance, and witness can bring peace to souls tormented by decades of loneliness. Until the next confession, and may no one you know have to wait 50 years for a dignified farewell. Because some funerals are not farewells, they are homecomings. They are finally coming home.